I'd just like to say a huge welcome to everybody joining us tonight. And it is such an honor to be able to welcome you all to this In Conversation event with the lovely 2021 Young Alumnus of the Year, Afnan Hannan. Congratulations. It's been such a pleasure to listen to all the work that you've been doing and to be involved in this event with you. It's really such a privilege, and congratulations. Now, just a bit of housekeeping in case you haven't attended an ANU alumni webinar before. All of your screens and volume will be muted just to ensure that we have a clear and connected session. If you would like to ask a question during the event today, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom. You can put in any questions that you come across during the night, or feel free to come in at the end. If you have any issues, technical or otherwise, you can reach out to the ANU alumni team at any time and we'll try and help you out. So that's ANU alumni at anu.edu.au. Alrighty, so just going on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional Australians on whose lands we meet, or any Indigenous peoples wherever you may be calling in from. In my case, I pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, past, present and emerging. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. This event is part of our Alumni Impact Maker series, which is a series of events where we invite our high impact alumni who are making differences in the world. And so it is such a pleasure to be able to invite Afi here, as he is one such alumni who is making a difference through his work and through his ANU degree and experiences. For this alumni event, we've been partnering with the Kex advancement team, and this is through both our Kex alumni and advancement team and our lovely Kex advancement, Lachlan Blackhall. So you really made this event possible tonight, so thank you. Petal, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about what you do, take it away, please.
Thanks, Tash. My name is Petal, and I'm from the advancement team at ANU College of Engineering and Computer Science. Our team of 4, Eric, Kate, Tom, and I, are committed to provide engagement opportunities and add value to our alumni community. You may have heard from us through our current initiatives, whether that being the quarterly newsletter on what's going on at the college, our alumni group on Facebook and LinkedIn. We promote jobs, mentoring, and partnership opportunities to our alumni and host events like this. For example, we have another alumni event coming up this Thursday at 2 p.m. Canberra time, where Professor David Hawking will talk about his book, The History of ANU Computing, and share his learnings in 50 years of computing. I will put the event link in the chat box. Stay tuned for more events and initiatives from our team. We always welcome ideas, suggestions, or simply a chat from our alumni. You can contact us at alumni.kex@anu.edu.au. Now, it's such an honor for me to introduce Professor Lachlan Blackhall from Kex, our event moderator today. Professor Lachlan Blackhall is the Entrepreneurial Fellow and the head of the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program at ANU. He was previously the co-founder and chief technology officer of Reposit Power. Through his career, he has had roles spanning research, entrepreneurship, innovation, and investment domains. He is an ANU Kex alumnus himself. During his time as a PhD student at ANU, he was the co-founder of the Innovation ACT and Innovation and Entrepreneurship Program. Welcome, Lachlan.
Thanks very much, Petal, for the lovely introduction. Look, before I begin tonight, please allow me to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, which for me also is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in the ACT. So look, a real pleasure to be with you here tonight. And a massive pleasure to obviously to welcome our special guest for the evening, Afnan. So I'm going to embarrass him by reading out his bio first, and then we're going to get into some questions from there. So Afnan's the co-founder and CEO of Okra Solar, a startup that provides energy to people in remote communities who are living off the main grid. So Okra Solar works with local energy companies to provide cheap solar and battery systems to remote communities to set them up in a microgrid. And there's several thousand people across Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines that have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy sourced from Okra because of Afnan's work. So welcome, Afnan. Congratulations again from me on being the ANU Young Alumnus of the Year, and obviously really interested to dive into the conversation tonight. So I thought that we might begin, Afnan, just by sort of getting to know a bit more about your background, particularly in the context of what led you to engineering as a discipline. So, do you want to maybe give us paint a bit of a picture of what led you to study engineering?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everybody. Good to be on this webinar, and awesome to have Lachlan moderating. He was one of the many inspirations that I had along the journey. So I'm also currently in Lisbon right now in Portugal, where it's a little bit early. So just waking up and energized for this conversation. So yeah, a bit of background on me. Basically, like when I was born in Bangladesh, right? But I grew up in Australia, and I was pretty, I knew how privileged I was, like being in Australia and having all the opportunities that we have to basically, learn and do whatever we want and have like a great education system. And when I went back to Bangladesh to kind of visit my family and hang out, I realized that, they really didn't have the same opportunities as us. And I was always quite fascinated with technology. Like I was building like real robots, which is like some subscription service to build robots from the news agency, where you do a bunch of electronics and stuff. And I used to build like websites at home as well with my brother. And it kind of occurred to me that actually, the world that we're living in right now is becoming more democratized, at least in terms of opportunities. Like the internet is allowing everyone to really start learning whatever they kind of want, which means in the future, perhaps you wouldn't have to migrate all the way to Australia to have great opportunities. You could probably get those opportunities back at home. But at that point, there were about 1.2 billion people that didn't have access to electricity, along with a lot of people in Bangladesh that I actually knew. And so yeah, kind of made it a mission. I think when I was like 16 or 17, to at least figure out how to solve the electrification challenge, and that's what precipitated me to want to go and study engineering at ANU. Unfortunately, I didn't get in my first go because I was too busy playing Counter-Strike in college. But I started with commerce accounting, and I passed Business 101, and after that I transferred over to engineering.
Yeah, really interesting to hear you say that. And I mean, it's always interesting, I think, to reflect on those drivers that you do have that kind of, stay with you through your education and beyond. So maybe, it'd be interesting just to talk a little bit about what an engineering education is like. And so, you're talking about as a teenager, this view you're going to electrify the world, coming into your engineering studies. Did you feel that then equipped you to do so?
Yeah, I think you learn a lot of things that you're not necessarily looking to learn while studying engineering, particularly at ANU. But yeah, one of the things I'm sure any engineer will say is you learn resilience, and you learn like camaraderie or teammateship, if that's even a word. But basically, I mean, like the engineering labs is really a place where a lot of people spend significant amounts of time sleeping. Right, it's like free accommodation. But yeah, when the going gets tough, like everyone would really get together and have to smash it out. Like I remember thermodynamics, which is such an interesting course, but also such a challenging course. And there were literally like groups of us staying together at the engineering labs till the early mornings, multiple nights in a row, like helping each other learn and get past that course. And so yeah, resilience and teamwork are great things. And when I think about it, what out of thermodynamics do I actually use right now? And aside from the refrigeration cycle, which is just fascinating to me, like how we can get like multiple X amounts of cooling effect from 1x of energy input from a heat pump. I think that's really cool, but the vast majority of other information in that specific course haven't been using on a day-to-day basis. But it teaches you resilience, teamwork, but also, you've got a lot of fundamentals that you end up using later on. And that's the beauty of an engineering degree, which is that you can start seeing heaps of, different information points in the market, and put that together and think from first principles, because you've actually learned these things in engineering. And I can jump into that later on when we talk about Okra.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, one of the things I'd like to kind of come back to later in the context of the work you're doing is just to talk a little bit about the sort of the multiple dimensions of, there's obviously the technical, but increasingly the social, and the economic understanding. Was that, is that something you took away from an engineering degree, or is that something that you felt you gained through sort of other broader experiences?
Yeah, so I think, like, remembering back to when I was at university, like, we had both professors, but in addition to that, we actually had, colleagues, and we were always inspired about, how can we use the knowledge that we have or that we're learning in engineering to do things in a way that impacts society in a better manner. So climate change was one of those things that was at the forefront of a lot of people's minds as we were studying, like, 7-8 years ago. I remember, like, while we were at engineering, like, kind of influenced by thermodynamics and the courses we were taking. In addition to that, we would, like, read books and be like, dude, man, we're going to get screwed by carbon in the future. We need to learn about how to actually pull this carbon out of the atmosphere. So yeah, I feel like it was something that we were always just passionate about, like, our generation. How can we leave the world in a better place than it is today? And engineering gives you the tools to solve problems, and ultimately problem solving is what drives a lot of humans. So I think we've just set ourselves up for really good and fun and fulfilling lives by studying engineering. In addition to that, I also studied economics at ANU, and that really helped out in the sense that it's like, you can't just have a great solution to a problem. You need to understand the psychology of humans and put in place the incentives to enable them to move in the direction that you need to better the outcomes.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So obviously you survived university and have gone on to great things now. So I mean, what was the spark that actually led you to start Okra? What was the pathway for the company to kind of kick off?
Hey, sorry, give me a sec. I'm just going to swap over to the hotspot. One sec. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
I'll do it live as it pops up. So the question was, what was the spark for me to start?
Yeah, what was the sort of, you finished university, what sort of led to, what's the foundation story for Okra? What was the spark that actually sort of, got you started with the company?
Yeah, cool. So I was working in a company, and like a few ANU alumni are there right now, and it's a company called BEng based out of Australia, and we were basically taking like millions of data points from commercial buildings and then automating the building's performance, right? So basically, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, all of that, just making sure that this building actually has less energy consumption and CO2 footprint. And it was pretty fun and impactful as well, right? But then I remember like just having a chat with one of the guys there who I really got along with really well, right? So he was the lead software engineer. I was in the product team, and we used to play table tennis at nighttime till like midnight after finishing work. And we're like, what are we doing? It sounds really silly when you talk about it now, but it's like, what are we doing with our lives? And we were doing something pretty cool, but the way that we saw it as being like young kind of people who'd just come out of university is that we were just helping some rich people who own these buildings reduce their like energy bill by 30% each month. And we were like, we can do something that's much more like meaningful to the world and to us. And he's like, well, what should we do? And I'm like, man, this energy access problem is a pretty massive one. Like, there are all these people, almost 1 billion people at that point in time, who don't have access to electricity. And I'm like, I think we could do something to solve it. And he's like, what could we do to solve it? I'm like, well, I'm not exactly sure, because I've never like spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out how people are actually bringing electricity out to these communities. And he's like, well, isn't like the lean startup principle, I mean, this sounds kind of nerdy, but it's like, isn't the lean startup principle or kind of by the books, but he's like, isn't lean startup principle to go out there and start with the problem first, and then figure out what the solution is? And I'm like, yeah, it is. And then we basically decided that we're going to go to Cambodia. I had some friends there who went to ANU as well, and just go out there and talk to all the energy companies and just try to figure out why the hell are they not bringing solar energy out to these villages? Why are they still remaining off grid? And some of the other things that we had seen at that point in time that helped us make that decision was that solar and battery prices were coming down like really, really fast, right? And also we were working building automation, and we saw the data, and it was like, wow, at that point in time, 98% of humans, even though 1 billion people didn't have electricity, 98% of humans had access to connectivity. So in theory, we could have deployed some solar-based automated solution. We hadn't put all the dots together yet, but we had some ideas when we first went there, and we tried to figure out the problems as much as possible.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think, yeah, so I probably should have said this earlier, but I've known Afnan for a while now. And I think when you came back from that trip, I remember catching up, and I felt like we might have spent an evening with a couple of the Okra team doing laps around Canberra City, talking about how to get batteries kind of configured and working and things like that. And it's always really like, it's very gratifying, obviously, to see the success you've had now, sort of reflecting back on seeing really the sort of nuts and bolts of when you were still, starting to work out what Okra was going to be.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And that's one of the big, I guess, lessons that I learned along the journey, which is like, don't be afraid to reach out to people who definitely know more than you, to try and, triangulate and get to the bottom of the problems that you wouldn't be able to solve otherwise. And that's just helped us immensely. Just having no shame, shamelessly asking for support and guidance.
Oh, and I think Canberra, I mean, sort of my experience too, is that Canberra is actually a really good place to do that. Probably underappreciated, actually, in terms of the value that, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in Canberra, who are very, very willing to help. And on my, from my perspective, certainly as I was going through my entrepreneurial journey, I felt that just, being able to kind of reach out and ask what might feel like embarrassing questions is actually really helpful, and then shaping what you're able to build.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've kind of, you've got the idea now. So maybe it'd be really interesting, to just to maybe reflect a little bit on, what does Okra do, and, what have you ultimately decided is the model that you're pursuing in order to actually bring electrification to rural communities?
Yeah, nice. So if you don't mind, I could actually share like 3 slides, and I think it'll be the quickest, and you can see some visuals.
Please do.
Awesome. Sweet. So I had to present some of this to a billionaire yesterday. So it's ready to go. So Tim Draper, basically a big VC, potentially going to be sharing this with them on a reality TV show next year. But so yeah, here we go. So interesting background that everyone on this call is probably aware of, but over the last decade, the price of solar panels and batteries have reduced by more than 80%. And an interesting fact, and I've been Googling this to confirm, but it's not cheaper for you to get a solar panel and make a table out of that than it is to go to Bunnings and buy a piece of timber and make a table out of that, right? So it's really getting very cheap, distributed energy. But still 800 million people today don't have access to the electricity grid. So that's a huge opportunity to actually solve that problem for these people. And these people, to add some background, they're currently still getting access to some form of power, but it's usually from kerosene or diesel fuel, running a diesel generator or an old car battery. And I mean, one, that costs a lot of money, and 2, it's not really giving them much power to live, modern lifestyles that you and I, kind of take for granted. But if we look at, the engineering behind traditional solutions at the last mile, it could be diesel based, or it could be, distributed energy based, but it's typically centralized, or it is, almost always centralized, in the sense that power is traveling through a centralized distribution line long distances. And so because you'd have a lot of power loss over a long distance, you use thick conductors and high voltages. And then that means that, okay, the cost of this line and the poles is now making up 50% of the setup costs, because solar and batteries are getting cheaper, right? And this cost isn't changing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is operating that infrastructure was also quite expensive. If the grid goes down, then, the whole community runs out of power because it's centralized, and you need to send someone all the way out to a place that doesn't have roads to even get to actually do operations. So 40% of the lifetime cost or more is actually in operations and maintenance. So this is a community in Cambodia, and it's basically running a decentralized, automated mesh grid. And it's basically like the future of last mile energy for many, many of the communities that are going to get connected in the years to come. If you look closely, there's actually solar PV on the rooftops of the households, and they're interconnected into a smart grid that's enabled by our technology. So this is our IoT device, the Okra Pod, and there's a panel and a battery installed at every house along with the Okra Pod. It's plug and play, so within a couple of hours, a household has access to electricity. And then the really big innovation is if houses are close to each other, let's say there's 550, 500, it's fully scalable. You can actually interconnect one system to the next with a plug and play cable. And when you think about it, now it's fully decentralized, and our smart algorithms actually push excess power a very short distance. So because it's now a small amount of power, a short distance, you can actually reduce the size of that cable by 90%, which is really reducing the cost of setting up power in these remote communities. And then we have this IoT device at every house, and it's enabling full remote monitoring and control of these systems. So basically you can automate the operations and maintenance, and even payment collection from these households, which is really reducing the cost of servicing off-grid households. And it's just making it really attractive for energy companies to actually go out there. So that's the incentive, to actually go out there and serve these households, because they're like, okay, we can serve them at half of what we were serving them before, through the mesh grid tech and the automation. And it's actually less, that it costs less to serve these people than what they were paying for diesel and kerosene before. And now they have 24/7 renewable energy. But yeah, that's a bit about Okra, and I guess I'll stop there so we can go back to discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, we're obviously very privileged, in Australia to have, really significant energy infrastructure that has been built over the last, 100+ years in order to serve energy. So we sort of take for granted the fact that we can kind of come home and turn the lights on and that they come on. So, I wondered, just in you're talking about these, new assets being deployed. I mean, ultimately, who's paying for them? I mean, how do you get these assets into the community?
Yes, that's a good question. So if we just start at where they're at right now, these households are paying between $150 to $300 a year for diesel and kerosene fuel, and they're making on average, the households that we're serving about $1,000 per year. So that's like 10 to 30% or 15 to 30% of their total income on fuel. So they really, really want power. And if you saw the price of what we're offering, it's costing roughly $650 for the CapEx, plus we charge software for automation. So the problem is these households don't have, if you've got $1,000 of annual income, having $650 to just spend straight away is not always available. So we serve this technology to DESCOs, which are basically like distributed energy service companies. So energy companies who specialize on accessing communities who aren't connected. They might have been selling a lantern. They may have been setting up diesel generators before, right? So we give this to them and we're like, hey guys, you can connect these communities, make your money back in a few years, and it's all automated. And so those communities who are getting access to just a few hours at nighttime, paying a crap load of money, they now get 24/7 energy for the same price or less, while the energy companies incentivize to just push this out to many communities.
Yeah, and so I mean, that was going to be one of my questions. Is obviously, Okra itself probably doesn't have the capacity to go and install everywhere in the world. So, going out through through these partners makes sense. I mean, what are the kind of challenges that you faced in actually being able to build a distribution network like this on a global basis? The distribution of the assets that you're selling.
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of complexities involved in distribution in emerging markets, right? So just to be transparent, but also not saying anything outrageous, but of course there's language barriers, there's cultural barriers, but there's other challenges like business practices that we have in Australia don't necessarily apply in Nigeria or Cambodia, where it's a lot about who you know and do you have the protection to actually distribute. And if you're looking at infrastructure, which is heavily regulated and considered a monopolized industry, there's going to be certain companies who are getting the licenses to energize all those places. And if you try to go up against them as a foreigner, you can probably win a few battles with a lot of effort, but if you're looking to become globally scalable, then the strategic decision that we made is that it's actually better to partner with all the companies who have those licenses and give them, the tools and the incentives to distribute clean energy much faster than what they're doing previously. So that's it, to put it bluntly. That's it to kind of give you the high level, but then to give you some specific examples, I'm sleeping in a car going to an off-grid site, and I wake up and there's a gun being pulled at my face kind of thing, and I'm like, whoa, what's going on over here? And then the driver is he's like, come no, we go see, which means come on man, we're going now. And then we go, and I asked the driver, I'm like, dude, what just happened? Why did and he was like, oh man, these guys, they're just always asking for money. And I'm like, why didn't you give it to him? We could have died, man. And then he's like, man, if you give it to them once, they're gonna ask you for it again the next time. So you never give it to them. And I'm like, well, what about the police? Why do these guys keep doing it? And then he's like, are you blind? I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, that was the police, right? So it's a different working environment, and basically you need to be able to navigate a lot of this at scale to do distribution, and the local companies are much better at doing that than we are.
Yeah, fascinating. So you've talked about the cultural side of kind of the business practices, but what about the kind of different cultures in different communities? I expect would respond differently to technology. Have you run into challenges about how you build technology that actually is broadly applicable globally?
Yeah, for sure. There's so many examples I could give you, but for engineers, an interesting one is we first deployed our prototype product and it had a clear front, and because we just wanted to see the electronics that we'd built, and then after we deployed it, we worked so hard on it. We ran a Kickstarter campaign and we were just super inspired, got it out in the field, and then we get a call back and our Kamai staff tells us, is they hate it. They want you to come and remove it right now. And we're like, dude, we were heartbroken. And they're like, they said something really horrible, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm like, what? And they said it's possessed by the devil. So we were like, wow, this is the worst review that you could ever get of the product. We obviously haven't hit the nail on the head. So we went out there, and when you think about it, this community was in the dark in Cambodia, and we go into the house to check it out, and there's just this red flashing status LED light glowing up the whole room, and it really looked like kind of, I could see the similarities between hell. And we realized that was the problem that we had, and we actually took all the products out, and when we did that, another person came and complained, and he was like, well, after you'd set it up, there was a blue light that didn't flash, and it was just always on, and it indicated connectivity is available. Like, we know that. And he's like, I was using that to go to the bathroom at nighttime. So, yeah, so you learn all these things from being in the field, and we now don't have a clear case anymore, and we have like a light switch that comes out so that it can always plug in directly from the pod at a very dim level. But some other globally applicable things are you realize that most people can't actually, or they haven't learned to read English as well as we have. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that a lot of people actually can't read at all, right? So to make it globally applicable, we've had to, number one, use like language translation into multiple languages in the app, which is something that we didn't expect to be doing so early on. And then number two is enable them to actually request support using voice. And that's been a massive game changer, because like, it doesn't matter now if a local maintenance agent can't read, they can basically see the visuals of like what the issue has happened, or they can get a voice message from the maintenance staff in the city who's using remote monitoring, and be like, hey, check this wiring and actually replace it. And that's like just unlocking better reliability and opportunities for so many people who are becoming maintenance agents locally.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, you talked right at the start about the goal of electrification, but it sounds like you're solving a lot more problems than simply electrification as you go into different communities. So I was interested just in your comment then, sort of in that context around sort of the other business models it's creating for the communities. You talked about new jobs for the distributed energy companies that are installing this. Do you see that as what are your learnings or reflections on those other opportunities that you're creating through Okra?
Can you hear me at the moment?
I can. Did we lose you for a minute?
Yeah, but I think, did you want to just repeat I got the last part. Do you want to repeat the first part? Sorry about that.
No, all good. I was just sort of thinking about the fact that you set out to do electrification, but obviously you're starting to solve a bunch of other problems and having a lot of other considerations there. So just was interested in your reflections on the opportunities you're creating for new business models around the descos and things like that. Is that something that you just would be interested in your reflections on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think, there's three that I would touch on. So one is local maintenance agents, right? Like, we just established early on that the cost of operations and maintenance is going to stack up, number one. Number two is, if you start putting panels on people's houses and they have no ownership of it, then they like ownership as in like they don't own the asset and they don't care about the asset, then things could actually go wrong. So how can we get these people involved while keeping operations and maintenance costs low, right? Kind of makes sense to kind of bridge those worlds. So we built a field app for these descos to use with their local staff to basically get issues that have been triaged based on the remote monitoring data and then sent out to them. So they can actually go and fix things locally, which keeps the costs low, but they actually get paid for fixing things, which gives them ownership of this whole system. So that's one awesome thing. And a bit more on the kind of traditional or technical side, if you will. One is like financing. So, I mean, these households, as I mentioned, $1,000 per year, they don't have, even though they've got like the same brains that we have, they've got the same potential that we have, they haven't got access to capital, they don't necessarily have great access to education. And as a result, they can't really leverage electricity. Like, if you don't have a refrigerator or a water pump or a laptop, how are you actually going to leverage that electricity, right? But we have found that if you give a household a refrigerator and they're either a vegetable farmer or a fish farmer, they're doubling their income in the first 12 months. So one of the things that we're actually doing is leveraging the data that we're getting on energy consumption and payments to create credit profiles for these households. And then we share that with the energy companies right now. And we've just secured a partnership with a microfinance institution. And we'll also be looking to open this up to like decentralized finance in the future. But basically people can identify households in communities that have higher income potential and be like, look, I'm just going to lend you money so that you can buy a pump, you can buy a fridge. And yeah, that's super exciting. Something that we're super excited about going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to this sort of privilege thing, it's, you know, I had an experience in East Africa where I hadn't quite realized how profound access to energy was. And you see that, you know, people all of a sudden have access to light at night. And I remember a couple of students saying to us, they're like, oh, you don't understand, if we have light at night, it means that we can actually study. And you're like, oh, I've never really thought of a lack of access to energy being, you know, such a major disadvantage, but it really impacts all areas of your life. So it is quite profound. So maybe on that, you know, on that note, you obviously, you know, you're having success in getting uptake at the moment. You talked before about 800 million people. So I suspect you've got a few installs to go to get to 800 million. You know, what's the pathway to, you know, to getting to those 800 million people? Because really that's the sort of the 7th Sustainable Development Goal out of the UN around greater access to energy. So, you know, how do you fully electrify all of those people?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think there's like 2 aspects of it, right? And yeah, that's really the thing that we have to consider as we're running like a massively transformational kind of business, which is that we don't just want to sell and make some money. That's not really our objective, but we have to make money in order for us to scale. And in terms of like, okay, what's a business model that works? A business model that works is finding companies that are doing large scale distribution or who have the incentive to energize households and basically let them do it way cheaper and way more automated. So they're like, okay, I don't care if it's going to offset CO2. I don't care if it's going to bring power to people. It's going to bring me money, and that's my business to make money. That's really what we've been doing. And then when these people deploy and they're like, holy crap, like, you know, we're getting a significantly greater return on investment. Plus we see all these other communities that are opportunities. That's a good kind of story and is driving growth. But that's at like, you know, us getting customers and growing steadily. But we don't want to grow steadily. Like 800 million people is a lot of people to energize. So I think a couple of things that we're going to need to do. So one is we're quite heavy in speaking with institutions like the World Bank, African Development Bank, the UN. These guys are all our customers or partners in some shape or form. And ultimately, they're going to be driving the incentives of a lot of these companies through funding and regulation. So that's one of the ways in which we actually have to address this challenge, make sure that all of these people put the money in to solve 100% electrification. And then by being positioned as the least cost technology, we'll ultimately end up getting a lot of that done. But then in addition to that, I don't think we can, and I think we've seen from evidence, not because of a lack of, you know, people who want to do it, but because it's just a complex system, having so many people trying to debate with each other to figure out the right way forward. You can't always count on that getting done. So the alternate route that we'll be going down is actually opening up investment into last mile electrification to the decentralized finance community. So that's basically people who want to invest in a percentage of ownership of bringing power to these people and actually get commercial returns from bringing power to them. And there's a whole lot of money, a whole lot more money actually going into that. If you look at the crypto markets today, the market cap is more than $2 trillion, right? So if you can start bringing that funding into impactful projects, then the voice of the people would actually be louder than the voice of the institutions, right? And institutions are there to serve the people. So I think we'll have to go down both routes to get it done.
Yeah, fascinating. I think I think you've started to talk more about sort of the global context, I think, in which we're operating. And so, as we as we sort of come towards the end of the in conversation part and head towards the Q&A. So just sort of for everyone who's on the call, if you'd like to start popping through some questions in the chat or in the Q&A, that would be great. But yeah, in that global context, we've obviously this year seen the IPCC report, which painted a pretty dim picture of the future if we don't deal with climate change. And then we've obviously had COP recently. I'd be interested in your thoughts and reflections on what we saw in what we saw come out of COP, and whether or not that's enough to actually address the really existential challenges that we are facing.
Yeah, it's a big question, Lachlan. But yeah, I think a few things to take out. It was great to see that the targets being set and people agreeing on 1.5 degrees. I mean, that's like the bare minimum that we need to do. But everyone committing to that is something that we as the people can now hold our governments accountable for. Right? And ultimately, like we've seen in Australia, there's only so much that the private sector, or they do have a disproportionate amount of influence, like big corporations, because they can go with a lot of money and go and lobby the government directly, right? So they do have a disproportionate amount of influence. But at the end of the day, like the writing's on the wall, it's crystal clear. It doesn't matter how much money those guys are going to make out of, minerals extraction, and how bad that is for the Australian economy in the long term, right? By not diversifying. If the vast majority of the people are like, okay, guys, like I've watched YouTube and I've seen, videos on how CO2 going out into the atmosphere is heating up our temperatures, and that's going to cause a shitload of every problem that we can think of is going to wash up on our shores in Australia in the future. These people are ultimately who the government listen to, right? And so I think on the one side, there's not as much kind of concrete steps for how we're going to hit this target, but because we hit this target, it's something that the people now need to hold our governments accountable for. One of the things that I wasn't, or like that I think we should move to as soon as possible is a global carbon price. And I mean, like, I am a free market economist proponent, right? But I think in some areas when there's such a big externality that basically, has the free rider problem written all over it with carbon emissions, setting a price can internalize this. And there's a lot of models on what that price should be. But if we set a price, I think, $75 per ton is something that IPCC report put out. This can have material impacts on us just being like, all right, who gives a crap about the commitments and the steps? Because now that we have a price, and if it's monitored properly, everyone is going to have to do the right thing to slow down carbon emissions. And I can give you some interesting examples. So one is our grids. We just sold the renewable energy certificates for a grid in Nigeria and a grid in the Philippines. And we sold it at not the highest market price, but about half of the target price that the IPCC report talks about. And that managed to cover 30% of the capex costs of these grids. And then what that meant was not only were the large densely populated communities connected, but communities which were a bit further off that would have been using diesel for a long time. It made it affordable for them to get connected to mesh grids as well, right? So that's just like a very clear example of how this carbon price would actually help get renewables deployed all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think surely a matter of when, not if, we end up pricing carbon. It's been, it's so controversial here in Australia, but particularly with the pressure we're seeing, I think, out of Europe at the moment. Hopefully, common sense will prevail, and this is something that we can sort of roll into the global toolkit of how we address carbon emissions.
Yeah, and I think something interesting there is that big companies like tech companies, and also individuals, they're seeing the writing on the wall. And so that's why they bought up, the renewable energy certificates for 20 years up front. And we're like, why would you do that? And then when you think about it, it's like, okay, well, potentially they're seeing that there is going to be an increase in the price. And so like, let's get it now. We can trade it in the future and actually make money off it, or we can buy it cheaper now so that, we don't have to pay a higher price for it later. So yeah, I'd say if now the corporations are getting on top of it, it's some good foresight for us to have to kind of modernize the way that we're doing things.
Oh, and obviously, if another outcome of it is that we get to increase electrification globally, that's a fantastic outcome for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, and we want to do that with renewables, right? Because if the next 800 million people are connected to dirty fuel, and the infrastructure is set up for them to get access to energy from coal-fired power station for the next 20 years, then that's going to be 20 years of more work that we have to undo, of dirty work we have to undo, right?
Yeah, well said. Look, I would love to continue asking questions myself, but we do have some questions coming in on the Q&A, and certainly would welcome more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I think the first one I'd like to ask is, again, sort of it's a big picture question, but what are the other things that we can be doing to sort of slow down and eliminate carbon emissions alongside some of the things you've already talked about?
Cool. So I think the major ones, clean energy access, energy efficiency, and then, yeah, honestly, in my opinion, like there's a lot of technology developments that are just taking place because people love solving problems, right? Like using better materials for building construction, right? 7% of all CO2 is coming from building construction. I think about 35% of emissions are coming from buildings, right? Like lighting, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. But efficiency is going in there from technology just because of the economic drivers. Like even, nuclear fusion, company just raised about $150 billion, if I'm not wrong, to commercialize nuclear fusion. And that's going to lead to abundant, net zero emissions and energy. So these technology advancements are happening and they're really exciting. But the bottom line is like the time is really limited for us to reduce our CO2. So two things I think really need to be incentivized. And one is to pay massively for your carbon that you emit. So that means everything from like increasing the price of flights to increasing the cost of extracting minerals, obviously, everything, right? And then the other one is actually, incentivize, governments need to incentivize removing carbon from the atmosphere and doing it in an equitable way, right? And yeah, worst case scenario, which I don't think is actually that worse anymore because we've already messed it up so much, is actually, reflect a significant amount of sunlight out of the atmosphere so that we can keep things cool until those carbon capture technologies actually get to where we need it to be.
Yeah, I mean, the geoengineering looks a little scary to me because you want to make sure you get that right.
Yeah, absolutely. But we also wanted to make sure that we get extracting minerals out of the ground right. And we weren't afraid of that, right? So now we have to go the other way.
Absolutely. Look, another question that's here, I think this sort of goes from the large scale to the smaller scale. But have you seen what have been the environmental improvements or consequences that you've seen in areas that have shifted from diesel to using renewables in the grids that you've deployed?
So environmental, as in like in terms of the ecology and the nature.
I think that's it. Yeah, I think I'm interpreting somebody else's question, but yes, I think that's what they would have been shooting for.
Okay, nice. Yeah, well, I think, something that was kind of a little bit odd to me is when I first arrived to some of these villages, which are literally in the hardest to reach parts of the world because they don't have electricity, they don't have roads. Like it's really hard to get out there, right? Like you have to take a boat really, really far and then take a motorbike to get there. But then when you actually get to these places, because there's humans there, there's somehow like all of these like empty jerry cans of diesel, and like the water is just like, you know, polluted with like bubbly, yeah, like wash over from the diesel fuel that they're running in their water pumps and stuff. And so it's a little bit sad to see. And now all of these communities are connected to, you know, solar-based energy, which is really, really cool. And they're not using diesel anymore. There's just no incentive for them to do so. And they're doing some really, really interesting things with it as well. So again, I'll tell you an interesting story. Like one of the first communities we visited in Cambodia, there was a lady who had a mobile phone, and we're like, how did you get this phone? Like it's a Samsung S6 Edge, and she was using Facebook on it. And I'm like, how did you get this phone? Like, we came here to find a community that doesn't have electricity. And then she's like, oh yeah, like, I take this phone and I give it to that boatman, and then he drives it to another island. They have a diesel generator. They charge up the phone and then give it back to me. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. You guys really, really want this phone. And think about it, like they're driving an entire boat to charge a phone when you could just have like a solar panel there to charge it from where it is, right? So yeah, she now uses Facebook without having to send her phone to another island. So that's just one of many stories of how it's changing their lives. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting actually, because you've mentioned this a couple of times around the fact that there is existing connectivity, you know, for telephones before there's electrification. Are there lessons that we should be learning from sort of the, you know, connectivity in developing communities that we can apply to electrification?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the things that these emerging market countries did was, you know, what we call technological leapfrogging, right? So we used the landline, and then now we're at NBN, which is awesome in Australia, in theory, from what I hear. And in these developing countries, they were just like, well, it's so much cheaper for us to just set up a tower and use, you know, radio and send that information, like high connectivity information, all the way out there without the landline. And so they managed to get coverage out at a much faster rate at high bandwidth using just mobile data, so non-wired, right? And it's fully decentralized in that sense. So basically with electrification and other forms of infrastructure, we can think for a greenfield scenario how to do things the best. And when you think that way, just so many opportunities open up to you, because you're like, all right, actually, why do I have to do things the same way it was done the last, you know, 50 or 100 years? We've got a different set of circumstances now. We now have everyone that has connectivity. We have like solar and batteries that are just way cheaper than, you know, diesel or coal, setting up a coal-fired power station. So how are these set of circumstances going to enable a more optimal solution? And that's really how we've come up with Okra, right? But it doesn't actually stop there. Like, we have to keep innovating, because there's other things that are happening. For example, you know, finance. Like, do we need to go to a big project finance organization that basically will take 12 months to evaluate a project because they're used to evaluating a coal-fired power station? Or do we go to, you know, the decentralized finance space, where there's basically retail investors all over the world who are like, hey, I want to contribute to something awesome and do it now. I mean, there's going to be more opportunities for everyone to continue to innovate, because the rate of change of technology is so fast.
And look, that's probably a nice place to bring it to a close. I think, you know, it's been a real pleasure to have a chat, to, you know, to think through, you know, your story and how you've, you know, how you set out with a vision for electrification. And, you know, definitely Okra is on the way to doing that. I think what I really appreciated about, you know, the conversation was you're painting a very clear picture of the challenges, but also the opportunities. And, you know, one of the things that I like to think about is the fact that, you know, if the scale of the opportunity is defined by the scale of the challenge, then there's a massive opportunity at the moment, because we do have some really massive challenges to solve over the decades ahead. Thank you again for your time, Afi. Congratulations on being the ANU Young Alumnus of the Year in 2021. and we'll throw back to Natasha now.
I just wanted to say thank you both so much for giving us your time. It was, as Lachlan said, so wonderful to hear your stories and the sort of real application and what this looks like. And I think, yeah, your story about how willing she was to wait for that phone, even if it went through a boat and you had to wait a few days for it to come back, just how ready they are for connection and how you're helping that situation further. So good to hear your story and your inspirational words, the both of you. I feel much more knowledgeable having come out of it. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. I hope, or today, wherever you're from, Affy's nice and early in the morning. I hope you've learned as much as we have during this session. I'd just like to say that this session has been recorded. So if you'd like to come back to a few things, maybe you got some inspiration from Affy and you've got your own company idea ready, you can have a little look at the notes there. So that'll be made available on our Alumni Impact Maker series website. We also do have the Kex Alumni Event. So Petal has kindly put a link in the chat, so feel free to attend that event as well, or check out the alumni website if you have any other events that you might want to attend. We also have Affy, who has kindly told us that you will be hiring early next year. So do check out his LinkedIn page for more information or connect with him to find out how his company works. I've just made available the website as well, so feel free to find all the information in the chat there as well. Thank you so much for attending the session today. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned as much as we did. And congratulations again, Affy, for being the 2021 Young Alumnus of the Year. It's been such an inspiration.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Great conversation, Lachlan. And yeah, look forward to keep rocking it with the ANU crew. And I'll see you guys soon when I'm in Australia for sure.
Definitely. We're looking forward to it. All right. Have a good night, everyone.